Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from the first of the witnesses from RBKC. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning, members of the panel. I now call, please, Mr. David Kerry.
Good morning, Mr. Kerry.
Good morning.
I understand that we're going to affirm.
Yes, please.
The words are on the screen. Would you read them out, please?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Please sit down and make yourself comfortable. Right? Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Kerry, good morning to you. Can I start by thanking you very much for coming to the inquiry and assisting us with our investigations? We're very grateful to you. During the course of your evidence, if I can ask you please to keep your voice up so that the person who sits to your right can get down on the transcript everything you're saying in a clear way. Also, please don't nod or shake your head. You have to say yes or no, as the case may be, because gestures don't come out on the transcript. If during the course of my questions there's a question you don't understand or you want me to repeat or put in a different way, I can do that. I should also say that we're going to be taking breaks in the normal way, mid-morning and mid-afternoon. But if you need a break at any other time, please don't hesitate to say, and we can do that. We can take a break.
Thank you.
Now, you've provided two witness statements for the inquiry. They will appear, as will all other documents I'm going to show you, on your screen in front of you. Your first statement is at RBK 3033579, please. If you look at the first page, can you confirm that that is the first page of your first statement?
Yes.
And if you go, please, to page 26, you can see a date and a signature at the bottom of the screen. Page 26. There's your name under the statement of truth, and above the date of the 30th of October 2018 is a signature. Is that your signature?
Yes.
Thank you. Can we please go to your second statement, which is RBK 3058091, and can you confirm that that's your second aftermath witness statement?
Yes.
And if we could turn, please, to page 58. You can see that at the top of the screen is your name under the statement of truth, which I think appears on the previous page. There's a signature above the date of the 11th of March 2020. Can you please confirm that that is your signature?
Yes.
Have you read these two statements recently?
Yes.
And can you confirm that their contents are true?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, I want to ask you first about your professional background, and just this is a yes/no exchange, but if it's not, let me know. Is it right that from October 2005 until you retired in September 2019, you were manager of the Contingency Planning Team at the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, RBKC?
Yes.
And I think in your statement you refer to contingency planning and emergency planning as interchangeable terms referring to the same activity. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Now, is it right also that you have an extensive history of working in the field of contingency or emergency planning? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, and I think it's right that before you joined RBKC, you worked at the London Borough of Hounslow from 1990 as the contingency officer and then later as head of contingency planning.
Yes.
And I think that was until you moved to RBKC in October 2005.
Yes.
Yes. Now, in your statement, you've set out that your career in emergency planning was born out of interest and experience rather than formal qualifications. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And is it right that over the years you've completed emergency planning courses and attended a number of seminars, workshops and exercises?
Yes.
And sat on a number of regional working groups and committees over the years, which you've touched on in your statement?
Yes.
And I think just specifically, can you confirm in particular you were a practitioner advisor to the LAP, the local authorities panel, which forms, and in June 2017 formed, part of the London Resilience Forum?
Yes.
And you held that role, I think, until September 2017, is that
yes,
right?
Yes.
And were you also a member of the Emergency Planning Society
Yes.
and held executive posts, I think, within that body?
Quite a long time ago, but yes.
Yes. And would it be fair to say in general that you had, as at June 2017, an extensive understanding of the field of emergency planning and the framework within which RBKC operated?
I believe so, yes.
Yes, and that would be, say, at a local, regional and national level?
Local and regional, some for national, but certainly local and regional.
Very well. Now, I wonder if you could help us then with understanding the mysteries of the civil contingencies framework. You told us that you joined RBKC in October 2005, and that was at a significant time, was it, in emergency planning because the Civil Contingencies Act 2004 had just come into force?
Yes, it was actually coming into force proper in November 2005, so I arrived at the authority just before the Act's requirements became, whatever the word is,
Right.
into effect.
Right. Now, it may assist everybody at this stage, particularly the panel, if you help us in explaining RBKC's responsibilities as a local authority under the Civil Contingencies Act and the supporting regulations. So what I'm going to put to you is really a set of questions confirming and eliciting understanding of how it worked. Now, is it right that for the purposes of the Civil Contingencies framework, a local authority, or LA, is a Category 1 responder?
Yes.
And in simple terms, is it right that a Category 1 responder is an organisation at the heart of an emergency response, which includes emergency services, local authorities and NHS bodies?
Correct, yes.
And is it right also that the Civil Contingencies Act places a number of duties on Category 1 responders?
Yes.
And those included, the duty to assess the risk of an emergency occurring?
Yes.
And maintaining plans to ensure that they're able to continue to perform their functions in an emergency?
Yes.
And is it also right that Category 1 responders are required to cooperate with each other in connection with the performance of their CCA duties?
Yes.
And that would include a local resilience forum? You would have to cooperate with a local resilience forum, such as the LRF?
Yes.
Yes. And I think in London, the London resilience is a broad term, is it, just which would identify the civil emergency arrangements in the capital?
Yes.
Yeah. Can we just go then to LFB 3061162, page 7, and what I'm showing you on the screen here is the London Resilience Forum chart that the panel saw in the opening of this module. And to the best of your understanding, was this the structure or shape of the London Resilience Forum as at June 2017?
Yes, it was.
Right, and you can see there in the northwest corner, if you like, the local authorities panel sitting alongside other panels, including the voluntary sector panel, the faith sector panel, utilities, emergency services, environment agency, all fed into by a number of other capabilities and boards. Now, if you go, please, to your first statement at RBK 3033579, page 4, paragraph 14. It's a long paragraph, but let me ask a question from it. Is it right that the Council fits into the regional planning arrangements, which would include the London Resilience Forum?
Yes, it is.
And I think the forum is not an entity, it's not a body of its own, it's a collection, an umbrella collection of organisations.
It is.
Yes. And in addition to the LRF, the London Resilience Forum, there's also something called the London Resilience Partnership. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And is that an umbrella for 170 organisations who are both Category 1 and Category 2 responders?
Yes, I think that's a good description.
Right. And I think is this right? It also includes other organisations who are not classified as responders by the CCA, such as the military?
Yes.
Yes, I see. And also voluntary and faith sectors, I think, who are not category responders at all. Now, if we turn the page to page 5 of your statement, first statement, paragraph 15, you explain there that the LRF, the London Resilience Forum, is split up into sector panels, as you say in the first sentence there, and they represent the interests of different sectors. And you say in the second sentence there, third line, the remit of the Local Authorities Panel, LAP, is to essentially bring together, where appropriate, the 33 local authorities across London. As a council, it is obviously the LA panel which is most relevant to our work. The LAP consists of 6 chief executives, one for each of the 6 sub-regional groupings of boroughs, and an additional chief executive as chair of LAP. LAP is supported by a secretariat provided by the London Resilience Group and by a liaison officer. An emergency/contingency planning manager from one of the 33 LAs also assists as practitioner advisor. I held this position until September 2017. I've read that out in full. What was the relationship between the LRP and the LRF, the London Resilience Panel Partnership, and the London Resilience Forum?
Oh, I'm slightly not sure how to answer that, which sounds a bit silly, I know, forgive me. So the London Resilience Forum, it was the formal body as constituted by the legislation, and that gave it responsibilities. The London Resilience Partnership, I would best describe as being that much broader collective of organisations that in one way or another would work with each other and support each other to develop plans. All of that supports the overarching role of the London Resilience Forum.
Right. Now, the LAP, as you say here, was a panel comprising all 33 authorities across London. Were they also members of the LRP because they were Category 1 responders?
I think yes. I think that would be a yes.
Right. So just help me. A local authority such as RBKC would be a member of the London Resilience Partnership, but also, through the LAP, a member of the LRF, the London Resilience Forum.
Certainly through the LAP, a member of the forum, and the LAP represented all 33 local authorities for that. You'll have to forgive me, passage of time. I'm not entirely certain of what the relationship with the London Resilience Partnership was, and whether the local authorities were a part of that, or whether the local authorities panel was. You'll just have to forgive me. I'm struggling to understand particularly which line goes where in terms of that wider definition of the Resilience Partnership.
Either way, the LRG, the London Resilience Group, was this right? The administrator, the secretariat, supporting the members of the London Resilience Forum?
Yes.
Right. Now, you, as you told us, were practitioner advisor to the local authorities panel, the LAP. What did that role entail?
So the local authorities panel had 2 parts to it. The formal panel that reported or represented the authorities to the London Resilience Forum, those chief executives, was the strategic local authorities part. Sitting below that was the local authorities panel implementation group. That shadowed, if you like, with 6 emergency planning managers and support by the London Resilience Secretariat. And what we did at that level, and I was, as the practitioner advisor, I also sat on that implementation group, we would look at strategic issues the panel wanted to consider and provide that professional view. Would this work? Would it not? Did we need resources? Did we think something else? So a practitioner view up to the strategic chief executives. And my job was to be a part of that implementation group there. And then when the panel met, to sit as an advisor to that panel if called upon to ask any particular questions as a practitioner. So I wasn't a member of the panel as a speaking, voting member, but I was a part of the support crew there to provide a professional opinion should that be requested.
But RBKC was a member of the panel?
All 33 local authorities were part of that panel, represented by their sub-regional chief executive.
Now, a sub-regional chief exec. Who was the sub-regional chief executive?
So I think at the time of the fire, it was Eleanor Kelly who was the chief executive at Southwark. Before Eleanor Kelly, it had been Charlie Parker, the chief executive of Westminster. Before Charlie Parker, I think it had been the chief executive of Merton. So over years, within each sub-region, there would be a number of local authorities. Right. one of their number would represent all of those chief executives.
I follow. So is this the same thing as the SRRFs, the Sub-Regional Resilience Forums?
Yes.
I see. And what role did a Sub-Regional Resilience Forum have within the structure as at June 2017?
So as of June 2017, the sub-regional resilience fora were fairly recent. I've forgotten when they started as such. It was an initiative to get the emergency planners and their managers within that area together regularly to talk about issues, to support each other, to look at training and exercising across the sub-region, sharing information and advice.
I see. And how did that function differ from the LAP implementation group that you've just explained?
So the implementation group was very much taking its brief from the local authorities panel. The local authorities panel, looking at the strategic development of our emergency plans, might set objectives or future work programs. At the implementation group, we would work out how do we actually, as practitioners across the 33 local authorities, how do we implement the strategy that chief executives wish us to do.
I see. Right. And were the members of the implementation group drawn from the SRRFs or vice versa?
It was an emergency planning manager, one from each of the SRRFs, yes.
Right, I see. So the answer is yes. And now, just to be clear, if it's possible, is this right? In this particular case, I'm sorry, let me back up. Is it right that below the Sub-Regional Resilience Forum, the SRRF, there was something called the Borough Resilience Forum, or
yes.
BRF, right? And that encompassed the particular individual local authority, is that right?
Yes.
So each local authority in London, for the sake of argument, was a Borough Resilience Forum?
Yes.
Right.
Sorry, may I say, each local authority was a member of the Borough Resilience Forum. The Borough Resilience Forum wasn't a council body. The council or the borough was a member of, equally with other members of that Borough Resilience Forum.
So how just help me, what was the relationship or difference between the BRF, the Borough Resilience Forum, and the Sub-Regional Resilience Forums?
So the Borough Resilience Forum was the local Category 1 and some Category 2 responders, and any other organisation by invitation, very much looking at the locality's emergency plans where they spread across a number of agencies. The Sub-Regional Resilience Forum, and I'm just struggling to wonder whether I've tripped myself up somewhere in the description of that, because as I say, they were newer. Sorry, let me start. Forgive me. So, Council, 33, London Resilience Panel, and we had the 6 sub-regional areas. The Sub-Regional Resilience Forum, you'll have to forgive me, I am sorry, but I'm now struggling to remember whether that was just local authorities or whether that was a wider version of people. It was a wider version, so in a sense, the Sub-Regional Resilience Forums, as they had become, were the Category 1 and Category 2 responders covering that sub-region. That included the 6 authorities. The Borough Resilience Forum was specifically a forum for the locality, for the individual borough. So although some people would have sat on both, there were a lot of organisations only sat on the Borough Resilience Forum because they were more local.
Okay, I think so. So the SRRF would be a group of Borough Resilience Forums?
The Borough Resilience Forums, by 2017, and for about a year or so in advance, had started reporting the outcome of their meetings, the minutes of their meetings, to the Sub-Regional Resilience Forum. And I think the Sub-Regional Resilience Forum had come into being because it was too unwieldy for all 33 Borough Resilience Forums to be reporting to one central London body.
I see.
And therefore the Sub-Regional Resilience Fora enabled a breakdown, so therefore a better look at what the individual Borough Resilience Forums were doing.
So just to see if we can cut through this, you had the London Resilience Forum, you've got the 6 Sub-Regional Resilience Forums,
Yes.
And RBKC, I think, sat in the central group.
Yes.
Right? And then underneath that, you've got the Borough Resilience Forums.
Yes.
Now, how many Borough Resilience Forums were there per sub-regional resilience forum?
As many as there were boroughs within that forum. So the forums typically were 6 or 7 boroughs. So therefore, the local authorities within a sub-regional resilience forum, there would be the same number of borough resilience forums reporting to it.
So coming back to my point, RBKC was a borough and therefore a borough resilience forum, sitting within the central group of sub-regional resilience forums.
Yes.
Right, got that. Now, is it right that you actually chaired BRF meetings, Borough Resilience Forums, between 2013 and 2016?
Yes.
Yes. And turning to your role then next within RBKC, you cover that at paragraph 9 of your first statement on page 3. Let's have that up. This statement in front of us, page 3, paragraph 9. You explain there that the basic hierarchy, and just correct me if this is wrong, that you reported to Stuart Priestley, he reported to Tony Redpath, who was the Director of Strategy and Local Services, and Tony Redpath in turn reported to Nicholas Holgate, who was the Chief Executive and the Town Clerk of RBKC.
Yes.
Right. And your role was to lead the contingency planning team, yes?
Yes.
Can you just explain in brief what your role as contingency planning manager involved?
I had 2 members of staff at that time, so I was their line manager. My job was to provide the authority with an annual work programme that reflected the sort of emergency planning that the authority should be engaged in. Our local plans, where we fitted in with the regional plans, training and exercises, call-out arrangements, and liaising with other organisations, primarily through the Borough Resilience Forum.
I see. And the 2 persons that you line managed were, is this right, they were planning officers, and am I right in thinking that that was Rebecca Blackburn and Keith Robbins?
Correct, emergency planning officers.
Emergency planning officers. And as at June 2017, who apart from you, Rebecca Blackburn and Keith Robbins, ignoring those above you in the hierarchy, were part of the contingency planning team?
It was us 3 with the
you 3,
contingency planning team.
And Rebecca Blackburn and Keith Robbins, did they have other roles within the council, or were they full-time on contingency planning?
Both full-time and contingency planning.
Now, I want to turn next to pre-fire, risk assessments and plans, and start with assessment of risk. I think it's right, isn't it, that RBKC, as a Category 1 responder, was required to maintain a borough risk register?
Yes.
Yes. Could you just explain briefly what a borough risk register is? So
the Borough Risk Register was to identify risks of types of emergency that might apply, to quantify the likelihood and the severity and the impact of those risks, and to note mitigation measures that organisations might have in order to respond to those risks.
And let's go then to RBK 3036688, please. This is the Borough Risk Register, and you can see the date of issue at the bottom of your screen, December 2016. Issue 10. Was this the relevant Borough Risk Register as at June 2017?
It was in partnership with the London Regional Risk Register.
Yes. Regional. If we go to page 2, we can see that it was prepared by Keith Robbins, Contingency Planning Officer. Is this right? Presumably under your oversight?
Yes.
Yes. And if we go to section 1.2, which you will see on page 3, turning to page 5, which is where the main part sits out, profile of Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, you can see that it says who we are, and it says more than 1/5 of all households, 16,389, have a first language that is not English. This is the 4th highest proportion in the country. And if you go on a little bit below that, It explains that 61% of our residents have a UK passport. And there's a set of statistics set out there. In the first paragraph at the head of the page, there's a more general description, which we can read for ourselves, but pick up the point in the middle. It is also a borough of extremes, with some of the wealthiest neighbourhoods in the country as well as some of the most deprived. Statistics on deprivation show that North Kensington and parts of Earl's Court and South Chelsea face complex combinations of problems such as low incomes, relatively high unemployment, and poor health and well-being. And then if we go to page 9 in this document, we can see a list of the borough's risks. And 3.1, table of risks. Risk 1, influenza epidemic. Risk 2, emerging infectious diseases, which is of interest. But then under 9, building collapse, but nothing there for fire. You see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Does it follow that a fire in a tower block was not considered at the time this list was compiled to be a main risk for the purposes of the Borough Risk Register?
If I may provide a slight context to this particular document.
Yes.
The main risk register for any London borough was dealt with centrally by the London Risk Register. What we did as a Borough Resilience Forum, although this has got a borough, a council, an RBKC logo and everything else, we actually worked with our colleagues in the Borough Resilience Forum. What we did with this particular document was to say the London Risk Register, covering all of the risks of London, are there. Let's just draw out some of the major risks that might present the local agencies with more of a challenge in working together. So it didn't list every single risk that possibly could be in Kensington, Chelsea, because they would have been listed within the London Risk Register. This particular document, as I say, teased out what we thought as a collection of responding agencies might be the more challenging ones for us. For a fire, because fires would have been contained within the London Fire Brigade's response plans and everybody else's, there wasn't a particular fire risk in there. And there certainly wasn't a tower block fire of the intensity of Grenfell within there, but I don't believe there was that risk in the London Risk Register either.
Do you know why not? Given the history of tower block fires in London up to October 2015, including the Adair Tower fire in that month.
I don't know the answer to that.
Was it ever considered?
I don't know.
Right. How often was this risk register reviewed and updated?
It was reviewed on a rolling basis. We had 4 Borough Resilience Forum meetings each calendar year, and we took a proportion of the risks to successive meetings so that across a year the document in total would have been reviewed. So we reviewed 4 or 5 risks at one particular time.
And in relation to building collapse, as you can see, item 9, did the risk under consideration here include mass fatality, mass injury, mass evacuation, and mass homelessness?
You'll have to forgive me, sir. I can't remember the detail of what we had listed in that on that page.
When this was put together, did you consult other Category 1 responders, such as the LFB or the Metropolitan Police?
Not us as a borough in that level of detail, because that would have been dealt with by the London Risk Register and the people putting that together. What we did at the Borough Resilience Forum is we had representatives of the emergency services and the NHS at that meeting from a local area, so they would have been aware of and would be able to comment on, if they needed to, the content of this document.
While we're looking at this, I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor.
No.
While we're looking at this page, can you tell us what was envisaged in the expression aviation incident? Accident, I'm sorry.
I believe, and forgive me without looking at the page myself, I believe that would have been about the possibility of an aircraft crash or parts of an aircraft falling within the borough.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
And do you recall as a fact whether there were ever any discussions between RBKC on the one hand and the LFB on the other about any of these risks, or any risks which were not on this table?
I'm sorry, not specifically. I mean, we chatted both at Resilience Forum meetings and as we met at exercises or training events or other meetings, generically about matters. I'm sorry, your specific question about specific discussions about the risk in here, I can't recollect what that might have been.
Right. Let's then turn to emergency plans. I think it's right that you, as you say in your statement, and we don't need to go to it, but it was page 3, paragraph 11 of your first statement, that you were responsible for drafting the Council's Contingency Management Plan, or CMP.
Yes.
Yes. And at the time of the fire, am I right that that was issue 9?
Yes.
Yes, let's go to that. RBK 404396. Is that the document?
Yes.
Date of issue 30th of April 2015.
Yes.
How often was it updated?
It was mostly from when it was first, this particular type of plan was put in 2007. In most years, it was updated. In 1 year, it wasn't updated because a review of it said there was no need for an update at that particular point.
Right. And in fact, to be fair to you, there is a list of publication history on page 2, and we can see in the middle of page 2 your name as the author in collaboration with Denise Prieto at LBHF. And the publication history starts in 2007 and runs through 2008, 9, and then skips 10, and we have 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Is 2010 the year you were referring to when there was no publication?
Yes, I can see from the list here that no revision was required following a review in 2009.
Right.
The list rather suggests that we then didn't revisit it until 2011.
Correct. But this was the edition or issue current, was it, as at June 2017?
Yes.
Can you explain why there was no revision in 2016?
I don't think I can.
Would it have been unusual?
Most of the reviews were checking numbers, details, and required very little structural difference. In 2015, for this particular issue, we did a lot of work with our colleagues at Hammersmith and Fulham. We were anticipating the potential coming together as a combined unit, and we agreed as two authorities to harmonise the overarching contingency management plan. So therefore, Denise Prieto and I spent a lot of time together for the issue 9 in going through the whole lot. I think that was a very, very substantial review of that time, or check through. And I suspect, I can't answer you for certain, I suspect that, frankly, the following year, it just wasn't deemed necessary at that point to review that overarching document.
Even though, in fact, there had been some substantial exercises at the end of 2015, the lessons from which might have been wisely reflected in a 2016 update?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Right. Well, we'll come to those exercises later. I think it's right, though, in general, that, like earlier issues, this issue was a generic emergency plan supported by a number of annexes, I think 38 in total.
Yes.
Yes. And that would include a contact directory and plans for specific situations.
Yes.
Yes. Do you accept that this, as a structure, was a cumbersome suite of documents which is difficult to navigate, set out over a number of annexes, some of which were outdated?
No.
You don't accept that? Why
I
don't you accept
think
that?
that it was a rational way of breaking down elements of information that could be kept up to date individually and could be provided as guidance to people putting in a response. It's covered in the statutory guidance to the Civil Contingencies Act, where it talks in one chapter about the formation of contingency plans. And it reflects there that one way of doing a plan might be to have a series of annexes. So the advantage of that is that the overarching plan that describes, as required by the statutory guidance, the summary of who does what in outline, what what we're covering, how we're going to call out, how we'll recognise an emergency. In that overarching and public-facing plan, that was easier to put out and maintain. The individual annexes, very many of which contained confidential information or rapidly changing information, particularly in terms of names and contacts and what have you, were more easily dealt with in their discrete annexes. And those which required to be kept confidential because of the content could do so without having the entire document confidential.
Do you accept, and we can go through the detail if you like, that there were a number of annexes which were either left blank or left in draft form or were outdated or had become superseded?
Yes.
Yes. Now, as I've shown you, this is issue 9, April 2015, drafted together with Denise Preto of LB, H and F. What was the practical effect of the plan being a joint plan with LBHF, London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham?
The plan reflected that we had a lot of bi-borough services at that point, the part of the tri-borough and the bi-borough arrangements of the three authorities, Westminster City Council, London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, and ourselves. Westminster City Council were very much having their own plans and a lot of their own services. It was thought at the time, our managers above were exploring and putting the two teams together as a combined team, a bi-borough team between RBKC and LBHF. So in anticipation of that, it just became a good idea at the time, we thought, to harmonise the overarching plan so that in a response, whether the managers were from RBKC or LBHF, or were by borough managers, there would be some standardisation to the overall approach.
Nonetheless, was it the case that responsibility remained with RBKC?
Yes.
For an emergency response within the borough?
Yes.
Yes. Now, it might help then, having mentioned to us the tri-borough concept, was that an agreement between RBKC, London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, and Westminster City Council?
Yes, that was a political arrangement.
Right. And just under this political arrangement, it was contained in an agreement, a document, was it?
Yes, the three authorities
Yes.
had an agreement. There was a number of tri-borough services, but not all. Some boroughs had some single borough services. There were some bi-borough services with Hammersmith and Fulham. At one point, we had a joint chief executive between Hammersmith and Fulham and Kensington and Chelsea Council, with Westminster City Council retaining its own chief executive. These arrangements varied from year to year as the authorities learned to live with them, adapt them, and move on.
Right. Drawing a number of strands from the arrangements, is it right that your own department, contingency planning, was sovereign? In other words, exclusively concerned with matters within RBKC's boundaries?
Yes.
Yes. But there were certain, is this right, there were certain departments, such as adult social care, that were shared across three boroughs, the three boroughs?
Yes.
And we'll see, I think, later in relation to the RBKC response that there were staff who would respond on behalf of RBKC, but were actually employees of other boroughs in the tri-borough arrangement. For example, Sue Redmond, who was from London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham.
Yes. Now, on a bi-borough or a tri-borough service, some staff will put together in mixed service teams. Some might still be delivering single borough services. Everybody at the merger were retained as employees of the authority they were at the time of the merger, but they might well be working for other boroughs as part of that bi-borough or tri-borough service.
So, I see. So the deployment was on a service-by-service basis rather than a borough-by-borough basis?
Yes, there were individual service specifications for individual borough, even though there might be a bi-borough or a tri-borough service dealing with it overall.
Right, so under the contingency arrangements, the particular functions, both in relation to risk assessment, emergency planning and execution, were dependent on individuals who might or might not be employees of the particular borough where the emergency took place.
Yes.
I see. Now, returning back to the contingency management plan, if we can turn to page 17, please, we can see there, section 2.3, the role of a local authority in an emergency. And it says the role of a local authority during a major emergency may be summarised as, and then there's a list of bullet points down the page. The first bullet point is supporting the emergency services and other organisations involved in the immediate response. And just looking at those sub-bullet points, the fourth square bullet point down includes provision of premises for body holding centres, survivor reception centres, friends and relatives reception centres, brief and rest facilities for emergency services personnel. So was it right that the local authorities, one of the local authorities' roles and responsibilities in the immediate response was the establishment of survivor reception centres and friends and relatives reception centres?
No, the responsibility for establishing those was the responsibility of the Metropolitan Police Service. The role of the authority would have been that if the Met Police said, have you got anywhere where we could host one of these centres, if we were able to provide either our own premises or from our rest centre premises knowledge of somewhere where it could be used, we would do that. But the responsibility for all of those centres in that particular paragraph were the lead responsibility was the Metropolitan Police Service.
I just wonder why you say that, because looking at the text, the role of the local authority was to support the emergency services in the immediate response, including a number of things, such as the clearance of debris and restoration of roadways. That wouldn't fall to the police, would it? Mm-hmm. That would fall to the council.
Indeed.
Yes. Structural advice, making safe or demolition of dangerous structures. That wouldn't fall to the police. Mm-hmm. That would fall to the council. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And assistance in the evacuation of the civilian population, similarly, wouldn't solely fall to the police, would it?
An order for evacuation might fall to the police. People might evacuate themselves. Yes, certainly, but assistance in that evacuation, however started, and for the provision of premises, it's the provision of premises for those functions, not the functions themselves.
Right, but the provision would you accept that the provision of premises for survivor reception centres and friends and relatives reception centres fell to the council in the same way as the other bullet points above it?
Where we could, in support of the emergency services, we would provide premises that we were aware of if we were asked.
Yes. Just to be clear there about your evidence, I just want to be clear that you accept that the role of the local authority is to support the emergency services by way of provision of premises for reception centres and friends and relatives reception centres.
Yes, if we were asked to do so.
Asked by whom?
By the Metropolitan Police Service.
So is this right, that this plan contemplated that the council wouldn't provide premises for reception centres and friends and relatives reception centres unless and until the Metropolitan Police asked for it?
That's correct. The Metropolitan Police Service had the role of opening, should they wish to do so, those centres. And if they did, and if we were able to assist the police with premises for that, then clearly at that point we would. But we were not the authority that would decide to open a survivor reception centre. The Metropolitan Police were. So at that point, if the police did, and they came to us and said, have you got somewhere where we could use, we would assist them with that. And
then the next bullet point down about 2/3 of the way down your screen, providing support services for the community and others affected by the incident. This could include, first bullet, provision of emergency rest centres with food and beverages, beds and welfare services, provision of a humanitarian assistance centre, which we'll come to learn later in the module is referred to as a HAC or HAC, emergency sanitation and hygiene, rehousing of those made homeless, both in the short and long term. And then at the last bullet point there, or sub-bullet point, establishing community assistance centres for the dissemination of information and support to those affected by the emergency. You accept, I think, that all fell to the council?
Yes.
Now, if we turn to page 11 of this document, back to 11, there's a reference at 1.10 on that page, there towards the foot of the screen, under the heading Related Procedures and Other Documents, to the national guidance, emergency preparedness. That's the statutory guidance on part 1 of the CCA and the associated regulations. Now, just pausing there, to what extent did the national guidance documents, such as emergency preparedness as identified there, influence the plans you drafted?
They did influence the plans. I did my best to reflect the relevant elements of the guidance for our plans in terms of what the plans would format. As I say, the overarching, the relevant appendices to annexes to that. So yes, it's important.
Just taking a step to the side for the moment in the questions. You drafted this and you said, I did my best to reflect the relevant elements of the guidance. Was this document peer-reviewed by anybody within RBKC?
We had the document and were aware of it. I don't think anybody sat down and did a peer review on it.
Right. Was any exercise ever done to compare your work on this document over the years, and this one in particular, with contingency management plans in other boroughs in London or other parts of the country?
No formal process in that respect, but certainly we would look at other people's plans. If we were drafting a new draft, we might ask others, could we have a look and see what you've done? The flu plan particularly, we did that in 2009. So when we went to tabletop exercises looking at elements of response that the London Resilience Group would run, at that point, of course, we would get an awareness of what other authorities were doing or might be doing within that. But that was all that part of that cooperation and looking at stuff. There was no regulatory look at what we had done against the Act or anything else.
Was there any system or structure in place, and it sounds from your answer as if there wasn't, but I just want to be clear about this, any system or structure in place whereby you were required to present these plans in draft to an authority such as, or body such as the LRG, the Secretariat, or the Sub-Regional Resilience Forum, or the Chief Executives, or anybody higher up the structure in place for London Resilience, so that they could say, yes, this passes muster, or no, it's defective or inadequate in the following respects? Not
the documents as a whole. Various parts of an authority's ability to respond were tested through the minimum standards for London, which the local authorities panel administered and the London Resilience Group did the Secretariat work for, whereby each year we were required to submit a return on our immediate response arrangements and selectively across the years on various elements of emergencies. Yeah. This wasn't the provision of the document, it was answering a series of questions. Did we have this? Did we have that? How many people did we have for this such and such? And we answered those questions. So that examination was given by the local authorities panel.
Yes, I see. And we'll come to the minimum standards for London, or MSL, later. Now, if we go to page 12, we can see that there's a section dealing with resilience, the London Resilience Partnership there on your screen, and it says that it has various plans and protocols showing how London would deal with the impact of different incidents. And then if you look down, there's a list, long list of bullet points, I think some 15 in all, which are not actually points at all. They are framework and other documents. So you've got the Strategic Emergency Plan, Command and Control Protocol, Major Incident Manual, etc., some of which I think are familiar to those who followed phase 1 of this inquiry. And if you look a little bit further down the list, you have the London Humanitarian Assistance Panel, London Mass Casualty Framework, London Mass Fatality Plan, etc. How did those plans in that list interact with the RBKC plans, which were set out in the 33 annexes that we touched on earlier?
So we fitted in at the overarching point through the CMP with the principles of the Major Incident Panel of the London Emergency Service Liaison Panel. So that reflected our local authority liaison officer and that sort of arrangement. We also ensured that the major overarching plan would fit in with the London Strategic Emergency Plan, so that we had awareness and could involve with the strategic gold group, strategic silver groups when they came through. In terms of the other guidance documents or frameworks, we had cognizance of those when we were drawing up any borough counterpart of that. So, for example, the London Mass Fatality Plan, we had a borough annex that fitted our borough part to what the mass fatality arrangements were. In our instance, the mass fatality plan was written by Westminster City Council, and that was for all of the boroughs involved in our coronal area. But I had an annex which pointed for borough staff to that Westminster plan and would outline what our responsibilities were for that, and that we did with others. The London Resilience Heatwave Plan, we had an annex for heatwave, and we reflected within that plan the local authority specific elements, particularly for our education and social care services, that if we had a heatwave alert from Public Health England, there was the shortcut for the authority to go to understand particularly what it might need to do at that point.
Right. I see. If we go to page 15, under the heading of a definition of an emergency, which you can see there in blue. The third bullet point down is major fire. You can see that.
Yes.
And at the very top of the page, which you can't see, but if we can scroll up to the top of the page, you can see in the second line, a fire in a block of flats, for example, entailing the evacuation of residents or tenants, will probably also involve housing, adult social care and children's services for emergency rest centre support, building control for dangerous structures advice, environment, leisure and resident services for clearance of debris, transport and technical services for highways management and environmental health support, and corporate services for a communications and public information strategy. What was it that led you to pick a fire in a block of flats as your example of a major emergency which would draw in all these services?
I can't remember. It was so long ago, because this would have probably almost certainly been reflected in earlier versions of that plan. Why that particular one, I don't know. It certainly was a incident which would require a widespread of council services. And my aim of that paragraph was to describe to the reader why it is we had an emergency plan, why it is we might need some emergency procedures to respond to certain incidents. And for a particular council, of course, not being a 24-hour response service like the emergency services are, it conveyed, or I believe it conveyed, there's all sorts of services across all sorts of departments which we need to bring together in a most unusual circumstance. Yes. Certainly a fire in a block of flats. We had fires in blocks of flats, both when I was at Kensington before Grenfell and when I was at Hounslow. So that was something I was aware of, and it as an example, it gave probably a good example of the widespread number of council services.
Now, on the question of communications particularly, can we go to RBK 30's 59598? What I'm showing you here is the witness statement of Martin Fitzpatrick. Now, he, I think, confirm this for me, please. He was head of the media and communications team in RBKC until 2017.
Yes.
Can we go to page 2, please, paragraph 8? He says my recollection is that the council had a long-standing and periodically updated emergency plan, and that this plan included a communications plan. This emergency communications plan was of long standing and had been periodically revised. My memory is that the plan was an appendix to the council's contingency management plan, and that it was stored along with previous iterations on a shared team area on the council's computer system in the team's shared folder. In fact, is it right, do you remember that there was no communications plan contained as an annex to the CMP?
I don't believe there was at that time.
Why is that?
I had in preceding years a couple of conversations with Martin Fitzpatrick asking him about emergency communications. My recollection is that his view was that his team understood the requirements set out in the London Emergency Services liaison panel's major incident plan, and what his team would be required to do, and that he didn't need a formal plan. I'm also aware, because I've seen more recently in reviewing these matters, that certainly at some point, I think it was Keith Robbins, had drafted a generic outline plan, and I think the intention was to try and get the departments to use that. But certainly I'm not aware that Martin had a written developed plan at that point. I had, in my recollection, discussed that with him at some point and got a complete no.
Right. What do you mean? When you say you got a complete no, do you mean that he refused to do one, or he told you there wasn't one?
My recollection is that he told me that he didn't need one and wasn't going to do one. That's my recollection.
Right. His evidence, and I can summarise this. Well, actually, I can show you paragraph 14 of his witness statement. It's probably better to do that using his words rather than mine. He refers to a draft at paragraph 14. If we scroll down to the foot of page 2. Sorry. Yes, thank you. He refers to Annex 6 and says, I'm informed that a final version of this document did not form part of the annexes to the borough's contingency management plan. I do not understand why this did not happen. What I can say is that while the draft 2010 communications plan may not have been formally annexed to the contingency plan, management plan, it was still adopted and adhered to by the MCT. Then he gives an example. Is that correct?
I'm certainly aware of that draft document. I'm certainly aware that my colleague Keith, I think it was Keith, had been working on that. I don't believe it was a adopted document on the actual list at that point, so I do believe it was still in draft. I don't know that I can usefully say any more on that.
Right. Do you accept RBKC's admission that it is made in its opening remarks to this module of this phase of this inquiry that it had failed to set out how different parts of the council would coordinate their communications?
I am not aware of any documents that set that out.
Very well. Now, I wonder if you could, while on this point, help us clear up a confusion. Can I show you RBK 3028631? Now, this is, or looks like, the first page of the generic emergency plan, 30th of April 2015. Mm-hmm. But if we go to page 5, you can see the passage headed CMP,
Yep.
Part 2, Tactics and Contacts. And it says, this generic emergency plan is supported by a Part 2 document giving information to assist in specific circumstances such as contact lists, procedures for flooding, severe weather, environmental issues, mutual aid, and so on. Contact details include confidential telephone numbers. This document is issued separately to those officers with a designated response role. Now, this was the version of the CMP exhibited by Nicholas Holgate, the then chief executive and town clerk. The version that you exhibited to your statement, let's keep this up on the screen, but can we go please to RBK 404396, page 5. keep both up on at the same time, you can see that on the left is the version I've just shown you from Mr. Holgate's exhibits, but on the right is the version of the CMP that you've exhibited, and you can see that although the sections are the same, in the version that you've exhibited, there is no CMP Part 2 Tactics and Contacts section. Why is that?
I can describe the CMP Part 2. I cannot tell you why there is a difference. I can make an assumption on that.
Well, can you explain as a fact whether there were, in fact, as appears to be the case, different versions of this plan floating about on after April 2015?
If this is the document that Mr. Holgate produced, I have to accept that he obviously had a different version. I would say that the version without that ought to be the published version. CMP Part 2 Tactics and Contacts was at that point, was a draft being worked on, and it wasn't finished, and indeed it was later subsumed into other parts of the plan following the fire. CMP Part 2 Contacts was a part of our exercise of harmonising our plan with London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, who had that sort of document. And having seen it, we thought this might be a good idea to produce our own version. It might be of value to people activating the plan from a silver point of view. And the purpose of the document was to list, and the draft that we'd got to so far, listed what the impact of that might be, which council departments might have a role, and where particularly there were regional plans that might assist. That was only in draft at that point. Subsequently, we actually subsumed that information into the role of the resilience advisor that we developed after Grenfell and into other parts of the training for Council Silver, and it quite simply no longer had a need. So although it was a draft, it disappeared out because it wasn't necessary.
Right.
Now, what I can't tell you is why Nicholas Holgate had a version that put that in. I surmise it might have been that we gave him an earlier draft before it was completed and we put it out. But I can't say that for certain because, of course, the bottom of the page has got the same information of the date of publication. So I'm really sorry, I cannot tell you why Mr. Holgate had that version, but I can tell you that the CMP Part 2 was a concept in draft at that point, which we later dropped because it wasn't going to provide the benefits that we originally thought it would do.
Was there a need in 2017 for a tactics guide?
I think there probably was, because at that point, our whole concept in local authorities of Council Silver was still, frankly, a little bit loose. It was developing. And the purpose of this CMP would have been to have given a resource to an officer in a Council Silver role and to use that as part of training. We subsequently, by putting in later the role of resilience advisor and a formal Council Silver and drawing up those roles properly and providing each of those roles with their own guidance documents, it wasn't needed later on. I think at that point it was a good idea, which is why we were drafting it, but it was still in draft at the point of the fire.
Let's go to RBK 405194. This is Part 2 Tactics, issued 21st of June 2016. Are you familiar with this document?
Yes.
Who drafted it?
The first draft was drafted by Rebecca Blackburn, taking the document from Hammersmith and Fulham and RBKCing it. It was a draft that got a bit clumsy, not from Rebecca, I hasten to add, but because it was reflecting in too much detail bi-borough and tri-borough and single borough services. And consequently, I didn't think it was delivering what would be of value to the intended author. I then took over the draft and started this draft 2. And it looks rather different internally than that first draft did.
Okay, so you often... Now, if we go to the index on page 3, you can see there's the contents guide. And if you go to page 34, this is the action guides for specific emergencies and responses. And the first paragraphs say, the overarching arrangements for responding to and managing the Council's response to a major incident or emergency are outlined in the Contingency Management Plan Part 1, Generic Emergency Plan. This section provides a series of action guides for a number of scenarios that might occur in the borough and for which additional plans and arrangements are available to enhance the Council's response. You see that?
Mm-hmm, yes.
Now, if we go to page 37, please. They're all blank. Generic major emergency response, they're all blank. Why are they blank?
We had the generic major emergency response plan setting all of that out. At this drafting stage, I was trying to apply my mind to some of those other scenarios. I would have gone back at the end and then filled in this part, because if we'd got to the point we were going to use the document, then the CMP Part 1 would have had more of it move into this one and out, and therefore there would have been a need to quantify that. At this point, there wasn't a need to, because we had the generic response, and that's what the authority was used to. So this is a draft, and I was putting my time where I could to trying to develop other parts for specific incidents.
I mean, was this document, put it this way, as at and after June 2016, did you expect that this document would be used in the event of a major emergency?
Had it been completed, I would have expected the emergency planning officer and the council silver to have had access to that document, so that if we were dealing with an incident kicks off, we start the generic response, and at some point, let's have a quick look at the crib sheet for this particular one. Right, there's a London Regional Resilience Plan here for this. I better make sure that, is there anything in there that I might benefit from? So that was the concept behind it. It wasn't going to be the response plan per se. It was going to be resource after we'd started the response, just to give a little bit of direction to particular bits of information that might then be of help.
My question was slightly different. I think.
I'm sorry.
As at the night of Grenfell, was this a document that you would have expected to have been reached for by your team? Right.
No, it was a draft. It was in the file. It wasn't published.
So it was a work in progress and not to be used.
Oh yes, yeah, yeah. So I'm sorry, I misunderstood you.
Right, no, that's clear at least. If you go to page 39, however, you can see there that there are a number of directions about mass shelter and resources. In particularly, what the frameworks are, and in the second bullet point under the first section, the fact that RBKC may be asked to provide basic shelter, and then in the next part, resources, RBKC has a number of identified shelters and emergency rest centres available to be called upon to provide shelter, and some guidance about how they're to be used and resourced and staffed. Would you accept that this document, though a draft, would have been helpful for RBKC staff on the night?
All of that information was already in either the overarching CMP or in the relevant annexes for evacuation and rest centres and what have you. So in this particular page here, it just highlights, if you like, what is in detail in those other plans.
Right.
So the emergency planning team, Council Silver certainly, and others would have been aware of those substantive documents and could simply go straight to them. So although this might have given somebody sitting there with a spare 5 minutes, let me have a look and make sure what I'm doing, that obviously in any instance is a nice idea. I don't think the lack of it in any way hampered the access to the information that was in the various substantive plans.
So what was the point of this document if it was simply reflecting something that was already in the existing contingency management plan and the London plans?
Simply because it would give a quicker hit for somebody to review their actions and to make sure they were covering anything, and particularly for the supporting plans and procedures, which the emergency planning staff knew in detail, but others might not know in detail. It provided that link there to show that there are these regional plans. The reason reason we didn't proceed with the document after is that by developing the resilience advisor role, an on-call emergency planner who would be there 24/7 immediately to support Council Silver would have all of that information and will be able to give that orally or to point to the document. So this document by that time didn't have the relevance because we dealt with it in a rather different way.
Right. Now, at paragraph 11 of your statement, first statement, page 3, I think we've seen it already, but let's have it up anyway, just so that you can see what I'm asking you about. You describe there how the contingency management plan sets out the triggers for what the council would do in an emergency. I think that's a summary, but
yes.
you agree?
Yes.
And if we go, please, then to the CMP, the contingency management plan itself, at RBK 404396. And within that, let's see page 38, section 5.1. This is entitled Command, Control and Coordination, subtitle Emergency Management Overview. We can see a chart, and there is the chart, which outlines the command, control and coordination of council services during an emergency. And is it right that, looking at it, just helping us through it, you have Council Gold in the middle, and is that the individual in charge of the organisation and responsible for formulating strategy?
Yes.
And that would be Nicholas Holgate at the time, would it, the town clerk and chief executive?
Yes.
Yes. And then you can see to the left-hand side, or well, immediately underneath Council Gold, you have Borough Emergency Control Centre, or BEC, Silver and Incident Response Officers, and to the left of that, Local Authority Liaison Officer, LALO, at the scene. And is it right, the LALO would represent Council Silver at the scene?
Yes.
And I've just shown you BEC in the middle. Is that right, the command and control of the council's response conducted by the BEC team?
No, and I think that's one of the misnomers about Borough Emergency Control Centre. It does imply that there's a control. I think we understand control normally means the people who are in control. I've never liked that title. It's a generic title across London. I would much have preferred Borough Emergency Coordination Centre because its role was to receive information and pass that out and to coordinate those responses. The control of the response was very much by the departments and those chief officers concerned delivering their responses. The strategy set by Gold, in this instance Nicholas Holgate, with a Gold team, which would have been other senior managers supporting him, that would have been disseminated out. The coordination centre very much receiving information from the scene, from rest centres, from other places, passing things out to departments to say, this is needed, can you do this, can you do the other, can you let me know what you are doing? Not that hard edge control that said we are absolutely deciding the response and we are deciding what you will do in your departments.
Right. Well, let's examine that further, if we can then, in light of that answer. Can we go, please, to the next page, page 39? And this is roles and responsibilities summary. And it says this: during an emergency, council staff and resources will be used outside of their day-to-day role in order to support the response. And there you see Council Gold strategic and the 4 bullet points identifying their responsibilities and functions. Then you've got the SCG, and then you've got underneath that Council Silver Borough Emergency Controller Tactical, and then underneath that Borough Emergency Control Centre BEC, and it says the place from which the council's response to a major emergency or business continuity disruption is coordinated and managed. Coordinate the council's response, liaising with Council Gold, Council Bronze Services and external agencies. So, is that correct?
Yes.
But above that, which I didn't read to you, the Council Silver / Borough Emergency Controller is, as it says, to assess the incident and activate the council's response, develop the response tactical plan for responding to the emergency, become Borough Emergency Controller if BEC is opened, supported by incident response officers, and liaise with Council Gold SCG. It looks from that as if, is this right? The BEC, when opened, would house the Borough Emergency Controller.
At that time, yes.
And the Borough Emergency Controller, sitting within BEC, would assess the incident, develop the response, and become the controller.
Yes.
Yes. So within the BEC, it's not simply a coordination exercise. It does involve, doesn't it, an element of control, as identified there by those 4 bullet points.
In whole partnership with the responding services and the managers of those.
Well, you say that. It doesn't suggest that in those bullet points, does it? It says assess incident and activate the council's response. So the decision, well, the process of assessment and the decision to activate would sit with Silver, wouldn't it?
Sorry, yes, I beg your pardon. In that, for the act, yes, in identifying we've got a problem that needs this plan to be done,
Yeah.
then yes, that's the person who would make that decision.
Yes. And similarly, developing the response tactical plan for responding to the emergency would be a Silver's job, not Gold's job.
Yes.
Yes. Now, there's a reference here, as you can see, to incident response officers. I think they're covered, aren't they, in Annex 3 to the BEC manual. Is that right?
Yes.
And we can find a full description of what they do in that document. But I think it's right, isn't it, that an incident response officer includes a BEC supervisor, a BEC officer, and a BEC information officer.
Yes, it's the staff of the BEC.
It's the staff of the BEC. And I think you say, or it says, that they can be cross-trained for emergency rest centre roles and on-scene lay-low roles too.
Yes, we had a number of people who volunteered for these roles who could volunteer for various jobs, and you'll see on Annex 1, the call-out list, that the names sometimes appear under different roles. I think that, looking back, is a great shame that because we had a shortage of volunteers, there were too many people that could do other matters, and therefore we didn't have sufficient staff discreetly in particular roles. Going forward, the authority sought to then address that by getting people in particular roles and not cross-training them. But yes, some of those people could either be in the BEC or could be at a rest centre. I think that was an inherent weakness at that time.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chairman, is now a convenient moment for the break?
Yes, I think it is. Well, as you were told, Mr. Kerry, we have a break during the morning, and I think this is the time to take it. So we'll stop at this point. We'll come back, please, at 25 to 12. And I have to ask you, while you're out of the room, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone else.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you go with the usher, please? Thank you very much. 25 to 12. Would you ask Mr. Kerry to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Kerry, ready to carry on? Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like now to turn to the topic of emergency staff capacity. Now, as at June 2017, Mr. Kerry, did you consider that the Council, RBKC, had sufficiently trained personnel who could undertake the roles within the BEC?
No.
So you considered that it didn't?
No.
So yes, you did consider that it didn't?
Sorry, I beg your pardon. We did not have, in my opinion, sufficient trained staff for that role.
No. I think it's right, as you say in your statement, that in the past, or in the previous past, you had raised concerns about a significant shortfall of trained emergency management staff to the RBKC Management Board.
Yes.
Yes. And I think you set that out in a document at RBK 3058038, if we can go to that. This is a report titled Emergency Staff Recruitment and Retention, dated the 8th of October 2014 by the Contingency Planning Manager, who was you.
Yes.
And if we go to page 1, in the box, the Council has insufficient trained volunteers for major incident emergency management roles in the Borough Emergency Control Centre. Support from executive directors is sought for decision. So that was the point, was it?
Yes.
Yeah. And then if you go to paragraph 1.2, second paragraph under purpose of report, it says this: there is now a significant shortfall in the numbers of trained volunteer emergency management staff required. Traditional recruitment methods no longer generate new volunteers. Demands from the day job are curtailing attendance at required training sessions and emergency exercises. Support is now sought from executive directors. And then if you go on to page 2, paragraph 3.1, under the requirements, 3.1, Borough Silver, it says a minimum of 10 are required. This figure enables sufficient trained staff to be available at any one time, allowing for annual leave, meetings away from the borough, sick leave, etc. And then underneath that at 3.2, incident response officer, a minimum of 20 are required. This figure enables sufficient trained staff to be available to cover 2 to 3 shifts over the first couple of days of an extended incident. And then at 3.5 on page 3, if we turn the page, please, RBKC and H&F, it says, have recently harmonised the roles and training of emergency management officers and harmonised core elements of our contingency management plans. However, there will always be a need for both authorities individually to manage the response to emergencies that occur solely within their borough. The Borough Emergency Control Centre, with an adequate number of role-trained staff, is a key part of our emergency management arrangements. And presumably that was how you saw it at the time.
Yes.
Yeah. And 4.1, under the current situation, it says this: the past couple of years have seen a decline in numbers in each category, and current trained staff numbers are Borough Silver ×3, soon to reduce to 2, Incident Response Officer ×10. And then you've got little footnotes, do you see, 3 and 4, next to those figures. And if you scroll down to the foot of page 3, you can see footnote 3, H&F currently 8 × 8, H&F currently ×20. You see that?
Yes.
So there's the comparator. So just summarising the position, is this correct? Borough Silver was 3, soon to reduce to 2, compared with London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, who had 8, but you considered 10 to be the minimum required.
Yes.
And so far as incident response officers, you needed 10, or rather there were 10, which was half the number you considered was to be the necessary minimum, corresponding with the 20 that LBHF had.
Yes.
Yes. And those numbers were against the backdrop of a couple of years, you say, of decline.
Yes.
Yes? Now let's then, thank you, let's look at the action sheet from the meeting that for which this was the report. This is at RBK 3058052. If we go to page 1, there's the action sheet, and you can see who was present at the meeting. Some familiar names: Nicholas Holgate, and from other modules, Jonathan Bohr, Nigel Pallis, is a familiar name. And if you go then to page 2, in the second paragraph down, it says, NH, that's Nicholas Holgate, suggested that existing by or tri-borough H&F trained staff could be approached to cover RBKC as well. This may fill some gaps. He asked that each of the 5 business groups nominate one person to the silver role and that each department nominate one to the incident response role. Now, that decision to seek to recruit each role by 5 places was still, wasn't it, less than what you had suggested as the minimum requirement?
Yes.
Why was that? I mean, what led Nicholas Holgate to go in so low?
I can't answer that because although I wrote the report and all of this, I can't actually recollect being in the meeting, so I don't have a recollection of the conversation that we had. Well, it wasn't a conversation. You go as an officer and the board to discuss and you get your instructions. It had been the philosophy at RBKC for as long as I was there to not have people appointed to roles and be on rotas, and certainly not to pay them to be on standby, but to seek volunteers for these roles. There are other reports I had done in past years, 1 or 2 reports over the years, expressing the same concerns and considerations. I think at this time I was actually asking for consideration about nominating individuals, making it part of their job to get the numbers up. But that was not how RBKC was doing it, and to be fair, that wasn't how most councils did it. Most councils relied on volunteers as well. It wasn't working, and I said so, but that was the decision.
When you say, sorry,
beg your pardon.
No, when you say it wasn't working,
we weren't getting the numbers.
Experiences?
We were not getting the numbers. It was, Keith and Rebecca would go out to departments and speak to people. People were not volunteering for it. There were reasons for that, I think. Everybody's very busy. Local authorities are lean machines these days, and if it isn't a part of a core role, within which somebody gets their time to go on the training and go on the exercises and be there, and if people are not on a rota, then we don't get the volunteers, which is why I went to the board to say, we have got a shortfall, this is not enough. The reasons why I said 10 and 20 for the respective roles was to have sufficient people so that when you phone down the list in the evening or at the weekend and you get voicemail, that there would be enough people answering the first call to get the first shift in. That's why we needed the numbers. And that was my best guesstimate of the sort of numbers to give you the likelihood of getting sufficient people on the first call. It wasn't the case then. Even after Grenfell, it took a while to get that sorted because it was still volunteers. We didn't have enough. We had an incident one Saturday where we only just got away with it, and I put in a report then and very bluntly said we were at risk of failure, and I very bluntly said we needed to do something. And at that point, the board coughed up, put some money to it, and the authority, by the time I left, was starting to get people in positions on rotas with a fee for that. That was making a change. But RBKC, right from when I got there, nobody on a rota, nobody paid for it, get volunteers, executive directors, go and nominate people. And they all say yes, nothing comes through. All I can do is put a report in, and I did. So we didn't have enough people. The reliance there on try and buy borough staff, only okay to a far. Okay, so mutual aid, and we did have mutual aid from those authorities in, of course, with Grenfell. But if you're going to ask for people under mutual aid, I think you ought to have enough people to also give under mutual aid yourself. You can't sit there and say we're not going to do something because somebody else could be asked. In extremis, as Grenfell certainly was, even if we'd had all of those people, we would still have needed, after a day or so, mutual aid. But that would have been fine. What we didn't have was sufficient staff to start with.
In that last answer, you identified an incident one Saturday where you say we only just got away with it. When was that incident and what was that incident?
I can't remember. I think it would have been in 2018. It was an incident in our block of flats down in the World's End estate in Chelsea. It was a Saturday morning. There'd been a fire in the electrical sub-room, which cut off the water supply and the electricity supply to those flats, and housing were told it could be 10 or more hours before that supply was put back. The lack of electricity was one thing, but the lack of water, of course, was another. So we responded, lay low, we had a BEC, Council Silver at that time was involved, but phoning down the list of volunteers to get the newly trained people on the list of volunteers, phoning down, trying to get enough people for a minimal BEC on a Saturday morning, they just got answer phone after answer phone after answer phone. It was Saturday. You know, people are out doing stuff. As it happened, although we'd set up a rest centre, although we had people out knocking on doors, we had communications and other things going, the need for support for people was so small that it didn't become a problem. And by the mid-evening, we were able to scale all of that down. But I wrote a report then to the management board that said very explicitly we came very close to failure and would likely fail on a future occasion. And at that point, and we were post-Grenfell, of course, finally, the new management board bit the bullet.
Thank you. Now, in brief, I think it's right, isn't it, that the issue, the problem of lack of staff in emergency response arose in 2016. You raised that again with Nicholas Holgate in that year, January of that year.
Certainly, I know I had raised it at some point in the past.
Yes. We can read the emails from January 2016 themselves, but was the position that the overall numbers continued after this time to decline?
I think it probably didn't decline any more than it was. I can't remember now the precise details, and I know in my witness statements you've got at various points the numbers that were there.
Yes.
I think we were pretty much at rock bottom at that point, and I don't think it substantially improved.
Right. We have the numbers indeed at page 11 of your second statement, paragraphs 5.2.4 onwards, for those who want to see that. But just summarising it, is it right that as at June 2017 there remained a significant shortfall in the number of available council silvers?
In my professional opinion, yes.
Yes. And I think it's right that by June 2017 there were only 3 trained council silvers: you, Stuart Priestley and Tony Redpath.
Yes.
So not even the 10 recommended back in late 2014.
Oh, no.
Let's turn then to a slightly different topic, which is training. In relation to emergency or contingency planning, did you understand that the council, RBKC, as a Category 1 responder, were under a legal duty to carry out exercises and training for the purposes of ensuring that its contingency plans were effective?
Yes.
Let's go to the CMP again, please. RBK 404396. And go to page 11, section 1.8, heading Training and Exercising. And it says, this contingency management plan shall be exercised at least once annually. The exercise shall test and validate the activation of the plan, the operation of the Borough Emergency Control Centres, BEC, the links between the BECs and council services. And then it says, training shall be offered in each year for staff with designated emergency response roles and shall take the form of specific training sessions, seminars and talks and workshops. The boroughs will participate in the regionally organised exercises for London Local Authority Gold and the London Local Authority Coordination Centre arrangements. Now, were these new training requirements or goals in this edition, the April 2015 edition of the Contingency Management Plan, original, were they new, or were they carried across from earlier editions?
I would have to look at the earlier editions, but I suspect it was broadly similar language across them.
And when did the requirement for annual training start?
It wasn't an imposed an imposed condition. It's something that just seemed to be good practice or a good idea to say that we ought to do it at least annually. I can't recall ever having that prescribed to me for that, but given that we were doing annual exercises with Exercise Safer City, and sometimes more, it seems to be a sensible thing to say. I believe the authority these days are now doing 2 exercises a year.
And as of June 2017, were you satisfied that these plans were being exercised annually in accordance with what's said here?
No, not fully. We were doing some exercises, we were doing some training, but if I look back, I do not believe as an authority we did sufficient.
Right, now you say looking back, at the time were you aware of your own dissatisfaction that the plans were being exercised properly in accordance with the plan?
No, I think at the time I was aware that we were not training people sufficiently for that. I think the plan was being exercised either through Exercise Safer City or Exercise Connects, but that isn't the same, of course, as a very in-depth, full exercise of everybody that could possibly be involved. So I was aware that we were not achieving that.
And what did you do about that? What did you do about the fact that at the time, as you knew, you weren't training people sufficiently?
I don't think I did anything specific. This was wrapped up in the discussions about we haven't got enough staff, and if you haven't got enough staff, you can't do very much training, and if you haven't got enough trained staff, you can't really do much exercising. But that sort of chatting around, I don't have anything in writing for you that says that.
I see. But were you confident at the time that those seniors and those decision makers within the council to whom you were making your complaints about understaffing understood that affected adversely the ability to carry out training in accordance with the CMP?
I don't know. I mean, they were aware of what training we were doing. No, I'm sorry, I don't know. I don't know that. I don't think I can answer your question about what they thought.
Did you ever tell them, look, we're understaffed, and not only are we understaffed, we're not able to train people properly in accordance with what our own contingency management plan requires?
I can't recall if I specifically said that. I'd like to think that that was a part of the conversation, but at this remove, I can't recollect particular conversations.
Now, is it right that staff with designated emergency response roles are those with Council Gold, Council Silver and Beck staff positions?
Yes.
Yes. And there's a reference to the Council Gold group. Who is the Council Gold group?
That would be the Chief Executive, the Executive Directors of the core departments, and 1 or 2 other particular professionals that would bring a resource, for example, legal and finance and human resources. So it's the strategic managers plus some professional advisors.
Right. Now let's go to your first statement then, please. Page 8, paragraph 26. You say there, regarding training within the Council Gold Group training consists of sessions with the Chief Executive, Executive Directors and a number of departmental directors. The date of the last Gold Group training prior to June 2017 on Strategic Command and Control and Recovery was 14th of September 2015, and it consisted of a table talk discussion around a fictional scenario, chalk and talk, and feedback. It goes without saying, I think, but obviously correct me if I'm wrong about this, that the last training session for Gold on Strategic Command and Control and Recovery was some 21 months before the Grenfell Tower fire.
Yes.
Yes. And what format did that training take? It says table talk discussion around a fictional scenario, but have you got any can you recall any further detail?
So it was a 2-hour session. I had asked for 4 hours. I was originally offered a slot at a joint management team meeting. I think Nicholas eventually compromised on 2 hours. It was in 2 parts, the first part on response, the second part on recovery. So it started with a PowerPoint presentation on response, which outlines the key elements of response from the CMP. We then gave them a scenario, and then in tables, mixed tables of people, for them to discuss what the responses at a gold level would be, what might inform the strategy. Then after a break, exactly the same, but for the recovery, so a PowerPoint presentation about the core elements of recovery, table-topped discussion then amongst those groups about what the strategy might be for recovery to that particular scenario, and then open plenary feedback and people reporting back on that.
And what documents were available? Did you have the CMP? Did you have the annexes? Did you have the guidance? What did you have?
Oh, gosh, I can't remember. They certainly would have had access to the CMP. Certainly they would have had on their tables from the CMP, the two first meeting agenda for the gold group in response, and then the first meeting agenda for the recovery group. Those are 2 pages within this CMP. Those were printed off and available for them. They wouldn't have had all of the annexes, no, but they did have the emergency planning staff there to advise or ask questions.
And those agendas, I think we've seen, well, we may see later, were standard form, was set within the CMP.
Yes.
Now, do you consider generally that the gold group training provided sufficient training in accordance with what we've read at paragraph 1.8 of the contingency management plan?
It certainly gave a good outline of what the roles of the gold people were and the sorts of issues they would be discussing, and a chat about that. I would have liked more time, because had I had more time, we could have gone into more detail and looked at more elements and perhaps touched upon some of those regional issues more. Within the timescale that we had, I do believe that it gave everybody there an understanding of what their strategic role was as opposed to the tactical role of others.
Do you remember within the training whether there was any education given to Council Gold about what criteria should be taken into account when deciding to go out and ask for mutual aid from other boroughs, or invoking, that's the same thing, London Local Authority Gold?
I don't recall that level of detail. It may be that we talked about mutual aid, but if we did, it would have but it certainly wasn't a core part of the course.
Why not?
I don't know at this point, but I did have only 2 hours.
Right. And that sounds as if, from that answer, that you didn't regard that as sufficient. It was a compromise.
Oh, it wasn't sufficient. I knew it wasn't sufficient. I'd asked for a 4-hour slot. I was first told that couldn't I do it in the joint management team meeting, like a briefing? No, we need to do this as training. I was compromised. I was given 2 hours. At the end of that training, as Mr. Holgate left, he just said to me, next time you need longer.
Was he the one who had originally resisted giving you longer?
Yes.
What did you say to him when he said to you, next time you need longer?
I didn't say anything. There's a limit to what a junior officer can say out loud to a chief executive.
Now, I've shown you that the contingency management plan requires training for gold each year. Could you explain why the training for the Council Gold Group was not undertaken annually, at least after 2014?
I can't answer that. I don't know why we didn't plan one for 2015. For 2016, I'm sorry.
How supportive did you consider senior management to have been in relation to training and exercising?
Not supportive. There was resistance for senior managers attending some of the training. We'd had that resistance in the past. For this particular training in 2015, I did ask, and Nicholas readily agreed, that we could put out the email to all of the, for needing a 3-line whip, is because everybody's very busy. And, not everybody attends everything, and we needed a good attendance. So Nicholas, in the email that went out from his secretary, I drafted it for him, but it very strongly told people that they needed to come. Having said that, I did have immediately an email from one of the executive directors, not with us by the time of Grenfell, querying why she needed to attend because she had done some training at another authority. So that just gives you the sort of instance, the issues of attempting to deliver this sort of training.
Did you form a view at the time about how seriously senior management, including the chief executive, took contingency planning?
I do believe that Nicholas did take it seriously, in that when he became joint chief executive, he actually called in my colleague at Hammersmith and Fulham and myself to give him a briefing, and he said very openly there, he said, I'm not from the typical local authority background. You will have to understand I don't have that operational bit. You will need to help me. So we gave him that initial briefing. We later on gave him a written briefing specifically about flooding, because there was a potential for a breach of the Thames Wall at one point in Hammersmith, which could have had some effect. So we were doing a lot of planning around that. So we gave some written stuff about that. I know that Nicholas had guidance from the London Resilience Group about the role of London Local Authority Gold before he went onto that rota. So I do believe he took the issue seriously as an individual. I don't doubt that. And although I've said what I've said, I did feel supported at times on talking about matters with Nicholas and things like that. I never got a sense that he was being standoffish about that. The other reality, though, was that, just getting people to go to training generally was becoming an issue. Getting people to volunteer for roles, as I've demonstrated, was an issue. It is a fact that in most local authorities, and certainly in RBKC, it is actually quite rare for a gold group to be formed in response to an incident in a borough, because in most cases, incidents are in impact small enough to be dealt with by a silver and one or two people in the back and a liaison officer. That had been our experience when we had incidents including some fires before. There might be a call to the chief executive to brief them and to let them know, but it was very, very rare for gold groups to meet and what have you. Now, I'm not excusing anybody. It's not for me to put excuses up. But I think the culture was that, a management board deal with issues every day of the week, and if they come together in a gold group, their job is to do what they do as a senior management board, but in a concentrated area. Clearly, as it was demonstrated, that isn't a sufficient attitude, and, much better goals training was necessary. We hadn't provided it.
Thank you. Now let's then turn from gold to silver. If we think about the council's silver role for a moment, was there any formal training programme for that role?
At that time, no, not a formal training programme.
So how did council silvers receive their training as required under the plan?
So that was a mixture of individual briefings and attendance at exercises and attendance at some other training events, but it wasn't a formal silver programme.
Why not?
Silver was a concept that we were coming to at that point. So we were in a transition generally across London in that role of management in an emergency. You've seen the expression in our plan, borough controller or emergency controller, in common usage, where a senior manager would effectively be in the beck who were managing that. And that wasn't particularly a council silver role as we would now determine it, the tactical coordinator. We were moving into that terminology, partly because Hammersmith and Fulham used it, so part of our harmonisation was to call that role, that developing role, silver. And certainly out of Exercise Unified Response the year before in 2016, where we really examined the whole emergency management bit operationally, it came out of there that we needed to say to London local authorities need to recognise there is now a role of Council Silver, which is not managing the BEC. The BEC merely becomes a tool for them. And the work that we were working on at that point across London, which got published in 2018, brought these roles out, the roles specifically from the BEC, guidance documents, training specifically for that role.
Now, how regularly did Silver get trained?
Oh, not regularly in terms of training. It would have been from the ability to go at an exercise from time to time or a tabletop from time to time.
I see. And who delivered the training?
Sometimes that would be Rebecca or Keith or me. Sometimes that might be a London Resilience tabletop exercise. Sometimes it might be the annual Safer City exercise, which was delivered centrally across all 33 boroughs.
Right. And was it assessed? Was the training ever assessed by?
No.
Right. Was it, in your view, at the time, sufficient to enable Silvers to perform their duties?
In the manner in which we delivered our emergency management response at that time, it didn't seem inappropriate at that time. Subsequently, with properly defining the roles, we developed across London, and I delivered in Kensington and Chelsea for our new Silvers post-fire formal silver training to a standard that had been set by London, and to so that everybody across London was getting the same training as a Council Silver, and the support documentation to go with that.
What triggered the change after Grenfell, then, in terms of the training delivered to Silvers?
Partly the experience of Grenfell, but primarily it was the drive that had started in the aftermath of Exercise Unified Response. Because Exercise Unified Response, we very deliberately as local authorities targeted within that exercise a look at borough emergency control centres and what became the silver role, because we were aware as professionals that we had thought, local authorities weren't getting to grips with that. We used that exercise. We published our results at the local authorities panel, and then we started a work stream to examine and identify good practice so that we could then bring those roles in. That work was in progress at the time of Grenfell fire. Following the fire, London local authorities put in extra money to employ some people to fast-track the work that we had started. So my revised borough emergency plan and Borough Emergency Control Centre manual in August 2017 took in the lessons as far as we could from our experience in the fire and what we had developed so far from the post-unified response bits, and we published those, and I did training at that point. That that BEC manual in turn informed the final product out of Unified Response, and a year later we had got a new iteration of the BEC management manual, the standardised one, and we had the training for that, which I had been a part of devising, where we had for each local authority the same training package, and I delivered that training for our Council Silvers and our BEC managers and our BEC staff before I left in 2019.
Right. Before the fire, what was the nature of the training provided to the BEC staff?
The BEC staff training was delivered originally by Keith Robbins and more latterly by Rebecca Blackburn. It was from memory, because I didn't do it, but from memory, it was using the BEC manual of the time very much as the working document. It would start off by taking people literally in through the door and how you open the BEC. Literally, where's the light switch? Where's this? Well, how do you actually get this room into being? And then they would be taken through the roles of the various roles within a BEC. That would be the direct teaching of it, and then that would be reinforced later on by inviting people to take part in exercises.
And how regular was the training provided to BEC staff before June 2017?
Before June 2017, it was as and when there were staff to be trained.
So ad hoc?
It was ad hoc. If we got some volunteers in, then a training course would be arranged.
Now, I want to ask you about rest centre managers. How did the crisis support team fit in, if at all, into an emergency response and the running of a rest centre?
So the crisis response team, which was a team which was in existence when I arrived at the borough, not part of emergency planning, but part of what today we'd call adult social care, although it drew people from across the authority. That was a team that came together, I think, following the 9/11 experiences and then the 20th of July 2005 experiences. And it was primarily there to give emotional support to people who might be badly affected, this is the public, by such an incident, when they were in Survivor Reception Centre or somewhere like that. They later on agreed that actually, yes, they would have a role that we could call upon them for emergency rest centres generally and provide that role within it.
And in relation to the specific role of a rest centre manager, how many qualified staff did RBKC have as at June 2017 to carry out that role?
One.
Who was that?
I can't recall the name, but it is in the annex CMP1.
Right. And was that enough?
No.
Right. And was it the case that RBKC was, in essence, completely reliant on the BRC, the British Red Cross, or other London boroughs to staff a rest centre?
We very much had taken the decision earlier, and with Chief Executive, not Nicholas, the previous Chief Executive agreement, that we would use the British Red Cross service for our rest centre staff. That was a service they offered. We had a memorandum of understanding about that. A few other authorities by this time were also using British Red Cross in that staffing way. Our view in doing so was that here was a body of people who were trained, uniformed, DBS checked, and had a call-out system to get a team of volunteers forward. It seemed to us to be the safer way to actually get the right people in the right time to a rest centre. I caveat that with the sort of rest centre experience we all had, of course, was nowhere near the scale of the Grenfell fire. And the resource that we had identified and agreed for, I think, would have been suitable for most other incidents that we were familiar with at that time.
Right. And you refer to the Memorandum of Understanding with the British Red Cross. Just for our reference purposes, that's at RBK 3058064. That was, you'll remember, dated September, or ran from September 2015 to September 2016, but had expired by the time of the Grenfell Tower fire. Is that right?
Sadly, it seems to have done so. That's an administrative error. It should have been, a new one should have been put in. But I can say quite clearly that that did not make any difference to the response from British Red Cross. The Memorandum of Understanding was something that boroughs were invited to contribute to because that was a way of channeling some funding to them in return from which they could do some training, but it wasn't a requirement of a local authority in order to get British Red Cross support.
Right.
Subsequently, after the fire, local authorities panel then got London to get a London-wide MOU with British Red Cross rather than relying on the individual boroughs.
Right. So before the fire, was it the position that the MOU would be commonly used between boroughs and the BRC, but not universally? It was
certainly not universally. Right. Some local authorities in London were doing the MOU. Quite a number of others were not.
Did you understand at the time, or have any thoughts at the time, about whether using the BRC in that way was a derogation of the responsibilities and duties that RBKC had as a Category 1 responder and as a local authority in relation to the setting up and management of a rest centre?
No.
Why is that?
It was identifying a resource for that function. The local authority has an awful lot of jobs dealt with by in-house staff and an awful lot of things dealt with by contractors and others. This was simply, where is the resource that is going to be available? That was a resource, as I say, trained for the role, with all of the equipment for the role, and with the ability to call people out and to deliver it. At that time, that seems to me to be a good way of discharging our responsibility.
Right, let me see if I can put this to rest, as it were. Go to RBK 3019712. I'll show you the first page of this document. This is the Humanitarian Assistance Framework under the NRP. And if we look at the bottom right-hand side, it says April 2017. So this was the current version, I think, as at the date of the Grenfell Tower fire. If we go to paragraph 8.15, which we will find on page 24. Page 23. Page 23. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Page 24. I was right first time. 815. The responsibility, it says, for the setup and running of rest centres lies with the local authority, supported by voluntary agencies who would activate arrangements as outlined in their rest centre plan. The decision to set up a rest centre will be made by the local authority, often at the request of the police, or I should say, fire brigade. So does that set out the basic arrangement so that local authorities could discharge their responsibility for establishing and operating a rest centre by leaning on voluntary agencies such as the BRC?
I don't think it takes away the responsibility of the local authority to be responsible for it, but certainly I believe it enables the local authority to seek a resource from wherever it might be appropriate.
So an outsourced resource, effectively, but the responsibility...
Responsibility is still with the local authority.
Right. And would that mean that the local authority would have to exercise monitoring and supervision roles over the BRCs or other voluntary sectors' activities in setting up and running rest centres?
Yes, my understanding is that the British Red Cross would put their staff in, but there would still be a need for a senior manager from the local authority to attend and represent the local authority and be responsible for the local authority.
Physically present?
I believe so, yes.
Right. Now, can I then turn to a slightly different topic, which is Pan-London? If we go to your first statement, please, page 10, paragraph 37, you say there that in addition to... I'm so sorry, we'll wait till it comes up. Under the heading Pan-London Training, you say, in addition to the training that would take place within the Council for Council Gold, Beck staff and the LALOs, as well as training for my emergency planning team, there were a number of external training exercises which RBKC took part in. Those in the years preceding the fire are detailed below. Is it right that the London Authorities Panel, the LAP, had specific annual training for local authorities run by the LRG, the London Resilience Group?
Yes.
Yes. Now, let's just look at one or two of those. Was one such the Exercise Connect training exercise that you've referred to?
Yes.
And that was annual?
Yes.
And was it right that RBKC participated every year?
Yes.
Up to June 2017? And was the goal to test communications between the BEC and the LLAC, the London Local Authority Communications Centre?
Yes.
And using the words in your statement, is it fair to describe that exercise as a communications validation test rather than a training opportunity?
Yes.
Yes. And that was presumably, is this right, to ensure that the communication systems were working in accordance with the minimum standards for London?
Yes.
And those standards were laid down by the LAP?
Yes.
Yes. Now let's look at exercise Safer City then as the next one. You cover that in your statement at paragraph 39 on page 11. If we can just go to that, please. You say there is also an annual exercise called Exercise Safer City, which primarily exercises London LA Gold and the LLACC. The exercise was held on 21st of October 2015, again on 9th of February 2017, and most recently on 13th and 14th March 2018. It is up to each LA as to how involved they become. The council runs its BEC for several hours, and the LA Gold test their ability to coordinate BECs and receive situational reports. Now, London Local Authority Gold is a term I think we haven't yet come across in your evidence. Could you explain as briefly as you can, please, what that was?
A rota of most London Local Authorities chief executives on a rota to be London Local Authority Gold, that if there was an incident which either an individual local authority was starting to need some support for, or if there was an incident affecting London, particularly at which London local authorities would need to be represented at the London Strategic Coordinating Group, one local authority chief executive would be able to do that and to represent all 33.
And is it right that before the Grenfell Tower fire in June 2017, Exercise Safer City was held on those two dates, the last one being the 9th of February 2017?
Yes.
And is it the case that RBKC didn't in fact participate in the exercise on the 21st of October 2015 because it wasn't relevant to RBKC, because it was about fluvial flooding?
We didn't, sorry. So the scenario didn't have any reality for the people in RBKC. Now, my memory's slightly going here. Can I ask you, is this the exercise in 2015 where we ran our own exercise within Exercise Safer City?
I believe it is, yes.
Yeah. So what we did on that occasion...
Was it, you say within? I'm hesitating to answer your question.
So on for...
But we'll come to it.
The exercise was held, Exercise Safer City. Core elements of that bit were that at one point the LAC, the London Local Authorities Coordination Centre, would send out a request for a situation report, and at another point a request for us to put in on a format of mutual aid request. Outside of that, there were a number of injects, as we called it, events developing and happening, which individual local authority BECs would manage. Because the scenario of fluvial flooding wouldn't work, we developed our own scenario and our own set of injects. We started the exercise at the same time as Safer City. We, through the emergency planning staff, did the few elements of linkage on communications with the LAC, but we ran a BEC exercise on our own scenario. So it was a borough emergency exercise.
Now, in that connection, let me just take a sideways step for a moment. It sounds as if what you did was to look at the London-wide exercise, decide it wasn't appropriate for your borough, and do a substitute exercise instead that was.
Yes.
Right. Looking back at some of the questions before the break that you answered about risk assessment, when you created your risk register for RBKC, did you do it from scratch, or did you use as your starting point the community risk register, the London-wide risk register?
I think we used the community risk register for London and took from that the key ones that we thought might impact on the borough, as it might affect the other colleagues in the borough resilience forum.
So if there was a risk which wasn't listed on the community risk register, the London-wide risk register, it wouldn't make its way onto the RBKC risk register. Is that right?
I wouldn't have thought so, no.
Right. Now, I'm going to come to the exercise responder, which you mentioned a moment ago, in a moment. Is it right that RBKC didn't participate in the Exercise Safer City exercise on the 9th of February 2017?
No, I think that's the wrong way to look at it. We ran our own exercise scenario within it, but we contributed to the London exercise by contributing the relevant parts of that exercise, which were to provide at a specified time a situation report and at another time a mutual aid report. So the elements of Safer City for the LAC, the London Local Authorities Coordination Centre, was about them receiving 33 SIT reps and their process of assimilating that into a gold report, and then later on assimilating a bunch of mutual aid requests. That was the exercise for them as part of Safer City. The exercise for the borough was either using the scenario and the injects from the centre, or with agreement, and I did have agreement to this in advance, of actually running our own scenario at the same time that gave better value in the training aspect for our exercise, whilst at the same time still giving the central exercise what it needed to be successful there.
Yes, I understand the relationship. My question was about the date. We're going to come to the 21st of October 2015 specific RBKC exercise in a moment. My question was about the one done in February 2017. Did RBKC participate in exercise Safer City held on the 9th of February 2017?
Sitting here today, my memory, I can't tell you. Is there something in my statements that refers to that? Or because, I'm sorry, my mind is a blank at that particular point.
The documentary evidence, and I don't want to misrepresent this to you, but suggests that the RBKC did not participate on that date because of staff shortages. Does that trigger a recollection in your memory?
That is triggering a memory of certainly at some point we could not get from our volunteer staff enough people to volunteer for an exercise. I can't remember the precise detail. I'm happy to take what you said.
Right.
Forgive me, it's passage of time, but certainly I do know we did have a problem where I think Keith reported we couldn't get enough people to staff the Beck in an exercise. And if that was the case, that was then, but if not, it was some other time. But certainly, I do remember that was an issue.
Right, thank you. Let's then look at the exercise done on the 21st of October 2015, which you've just explained. And we can go, I think, straight to the post-exercise report at RBK 30588067.
Right, yes.
Yes. Now, you'll recall, I think, that the scenario was a helicopter crash between the Westway and the Ladbroke Grove Bridge. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. If we go, please, to page 2, section 4, we can see there's the exercise outcomes, what went well, what did not go so well. And under 4.1, it says, following completion of the exercise, an electronic debrief was conducted with all participating staff attending. The following gives a breakdown regarding what went well, what did not go so well, and what improvements would you make. The responses are a collation of points raised by all participating staff, as many of the points were reiterated throughout. And if we look at 4.3, what did not go so well, we can see a number of them, 10 in all. Item 3 specifically, some IT problems in the Beckett startup. Number 4, too much multitasking early on, supervisor covering officers' work. Item 5, not enough Beck staff early on and need an information officer and a GIS operative in the Beck. Now, GIS, help me, is that a geographical information system person?
I think it might be.
All right. This acronym has defeated even you, it seems.
At the time, I would have known what it was, right. But with the passage of time, I'm pretty certain the GIS were the people that did our internal people that did electronic mapping of all sorts of things, and would have been a whiz to have had in to actually produce a detailed map.
Looking at 4.4, what improvements would you make? We need to scroll down, please, to look at that. Item 1, further training for Beck staff, including ILS.
Information logging system.
Yes, and scene awareness. And 2, explanation of acronyms, ironically. And then if we turn the page, item 4, and I'm not ignoring the others, but just highlighting the main ones for you. Clearer communication channels between all, including updates and feedback and structured handovers. 5, need to increase the frequency of borough exercises. 6, additional roles and recruitment needed in the Beck. And more Beck staff required for exercises, including an information officer and a GIS-trained mapping officer. So there they are again. What steps were taken to action those areas for improvement at the time?
I don't know specifically what we have done. I'm sorry, after this length of time, I can't recall. Keith Robbins did the exercise and did this report, and I admire its brevity and its clarity because it obviously gave the key bits out. May I see the top of the report?
Yes, of course. Page 1, please. There's the purpose.
Right, so that's written in a format to be given to senior managers, but whether it was, I can't tell you at this remove. But certainly the format of that report is our corporate reporting format. But I have to say, I simply cannot recall what did that report go or not. I just can't recall.
Right. But you would have known, wouldn't you, given your position, if these recommendations or suggestions had been put into effect?
I would suggest, because I can't recall, but given my reports in 2016 or whenever it was about the staffing issues
January
subsequent
16.
to this, clearly we didn't have an effective follow-up.
Then let's go to RBK 3058054. This is an email between you and Rachel Akanbi in January 2017, as you can see from the top. And it's about the next Safer City 20 or SC17 exercise due to take place on the 9th of February 2017. And if we go to page 2, we can see her email to you, among others, asking for volunteers. And she says, "Dear all, attached is the SC17 briefing note 1. This is an email dated the 5th of December 2016. Please note, volunteers are needed to work in ex-con for Safer City. The ex-con volunteers will be based at Exercise Control in Merton. Please nominate 2 volunteers from your borough." Second bullet point, "To make SC17 realistic, I require information on the challenges faced by your borough during the last cold snap of 09/10. Alternatively, if you have any area you think we need to test, please let me know." And Rachel Akanbi was the business continuity officer at Lambeth. So that's her email to you. Let's see your response, which is really where we want to go. Page 1. And this is the 5th of January 2017, so 6 months before the fire at Grenfell. And you say this: "Hi Rachel and Stuart," and it's copied to Stuart Turner at London Fire. "We are struggling with our BEC at the moment. Lots of BEC staff have left over the past few months, and therefore we have a recruitment and training task on at the moment. This means that we will not be able to run a full BEC exercise internally for Safer City. We will have our BEC open, we will respond to requests for sit reps, mutual aid, etc., and we will be using the exercise to provide some validation training for our existing BEC staff. We will also have some links with key departments that would be affected by the scenario, but will not be running this as a full control point exercise. I regret that we simply will not have anyone to spare for ex-con." And then you go on to deal with the experience of the last cold snap on Kensington and Chelsea. You see that. And over the page at page 2, top of the screen, you'll see your name at the foot of that email. Now, it looks from that, I mean, it speaks for itself, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Now, do you remember moving on, or moving back in time to November 2015, that after Exercise Responder, where you did your own sub-exercise, RBKC was also involved in another exercise called Exercise Babel?
Yes.
And do you remember that this was a different exercise because it was organised by the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham? Yes?
Yes.
And I think RBKC and a number of agencies participated in it, yes?
Yes.
And some of those agencies, there's a list of them, but NHS, Public Health England, Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, to name but a few. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Now, let's just clear up a little date question here. If you go to your first statement, please, at page 11, you'll see at paragraph 40, that you date this exercise to the 6th of October 2015. You see that?
I do.
But if we go to RBK 405188, the exhibits that you provide, including the post-exercise report, if we can just go to that, date the exercise as the 6th of November 2015, as opposed to the 6th of October. Do you remember which it was? Was it October or was it November?
I cannot remember.
Right. It is more likely, I would suggest, that your statement is wrong and that the contemporaneous document is correct.
I would accept that.
Right. Now, do you remember what was the nature of this exercise?
It was what we call a tabletop exercise. That is, there are a number of tables with a mixture of different organisations sitting around each one, a scenario given, discussion about that feedback, then a development of the scenario, more discussion and more feedback about that. The location of the incident was a tower block of flats which is owned by Hammersmith and Fulham Council, but geographically in a little bit that otherwise would have been KNC. So it was surrounded by KNC, it was right by the crossway. So it enabled not by borough as such, but it enabled both boroughs to consider that issue, because for an incident like that, it would be likely that we would be providing the rest centre rather than Hammersmith or Fulham, because geographically our buildings were there. And that's quite common amongst London local authorities, where if you've got one authority's got an incident by the border, the neighbouring borough might actually provide the rest centre for them. So it gave us that type of thing.
If I could pause you there and just scroll down, you could see the scenario. And it says, Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea's call centre has been informed of a fire on the 19th and 20th floors of Stebbing House, Queensdale Crescent, White City, W11. The entire block is going to be evacuated. An explosion follows, resulting in casualties and fatalities, which caused a number of secondary incidents on the West Cross route. Now, just almost out of curiosity, do you remember whether the LFB had any input into this exercise, into designing it?
I can't answer any questions about the design of it. Denise Prieto, the emergency planning manager at Hammersmith and Fulham, designed the exercise and did it, and then she offered to bring us in for that. And Keith Robbins from my team then participated with her in some of that. I attended as an attendee on the day, so I'm afraid I can't answer your question.
Right. If you look a little bit above it, under participation, it refers to the other agencies, namely the blue lights, including, of course, fire. And you can see a number of other participants, some of which I've identified for you. Did the LFB take part in this exercise?
My memory suggests they were there, and several of them.
Right. The reason I'm asking is because well, let me put it this way. Were you surprised that a fire on 2 floors only of a high-rise residential block would result in the entire block being evacuated and therefore triggering a response, the subject of this exercise?
Had that been a fire on its own right, I would have been surprised. But if my memory serves me right, this the scenario involved the prospect of some terrorism within it, in which case I wasn't surprised that the whole block would be evacuated for that purpose.
I see. Let's go then to page 4 of this document, where you can see a summary. And it says, the aim and objectives of this exercise were very well met. All agencies recognised that they would be under intense pressure, but they would cope. Mutual aid arrangements are in place and certainly came into play in this instance. Very positive feedback overall. The exercise highlighted the need to understand arrangements in general between boroughs when responding to an incident spanning both boroughs. And then it goes on in the next paragraph, in the second part of the next paragraph. The only grey area was with obtaining information with regard to vulnerable people from other agencies to get a picture as a whole. Who holds what? How do we get the big picture? And then under action going forward, it says, Tri-Borough ASC that's adult social care, I think,
Yes.
have requested that we run a multi-agency exercise concentrating on the issue of identifying the vulnerables as a result of this workshop. An initial meeting will be set up to look at what shape this will take. We are looking for this to take place before end April 2016. Now, was a multi-agency exercise undertaken concentrating on identifying vulnerable persons?
I don't have any recollection of that. I can't say yes or no, but I don't recollect it.
Now, note the date, although we'll come in detail to it a little bit later in your evidence, but note the date, 6th of November 2015. Do you recall that that's about a week after a fire at Adair House in the borough, in which there was a mass evacuation by LFB?
I certainly remember the Adair Tower fire.
Right. What do you remember about it?
Well, I was the on-call borough duty officer that day, so therefore I got the call from our call centre to say that, I got the call from our call centre, who would have been called by one of the emergency services to say that there was this fire there. So therefore I activated our emergency procedures for that. And I was effectively the BEC from where I was for that. I had a lay low at the scene. I then sent one of my emergency planning officers to back that up. Housing were involved, the tenant management organisation were involved. There was fire damage to, I think, 4 flats on 1 floor. Certainly 1 person taken to hospital with smoke inhalation, possibly 2. Indications from the fire brigade quite early on that the evacuation for most people would not be for a very long period. I had put on standby one of our designated rest centres, and I think I'd put an alert call out to British Red Cross, but a local church opened its doors spontaneously, and when my emergency planning officer, Keith Robbins, went there to look at it, his assessment was that the community were being adequately looked for, and we thought, well, pointless moving people from there to somewhere else for only a couple of hours before they go home. My recollection is that people mostly were allowed to go home fairly rapidly, and that housing and tenant management organisation between them were dealing with then the rehousing of those people that were unable to go home because their flats were too badly damaged for that.
Now, moving on then to exercise. Well, so before I leave Babel, was the TMO involved in the exercise Babel?
I don't think so.
Given that it involved evacuation, was there any thought given to involving the TMO?
I don't know. I'm not aware of that.
All right. Let's then move to another exercise in 2016 that you refer to in your statement, namely Exercise Unified Response in that year. I think that was a 4-day response exercise, yes?
Yes.
And it was a live response for the emergency services, but I think it's right that a number of different local authorities came together to run a BEC for 4 days. Is that right? So, and there were 8 shifts across 4 days, yes?
Yes.
And the focus, or one of the focuses, is this right, was running a mutual aid BEC.
Yes, very purposely, not to put entire council BEC teams in, but very purposely to put totally mixtures of people in,
right,
knowing that that would provide some issues so that we could identify those and move forward with a standardisation project.
I see. Did you have a role in that exercise?
I was one of 2 observers of that BEC. I was part of the team supporting Joe Cousins at Lambeth, who ran that part of the exercise for us. So in sort of scoping the place out and sort of general advice about what we were going to do there. But on the exercise itself, Marion Hearns from the City of London Corporation, an emergency planner there, and I spent 4 days observing and noting down and recording our observations about the 8 BEC shifts and the 8 BEC managers or council silvers that were involved across those 4 shifts. And from that, we wrote a multi-page document setting out the experiences we observed and with a series of recommendations to take matters forward. And that report went to the local authorities panel.
And let's look at it. I think it's this document, RBK 3033595, please. Is that the document? The report?
Yes.
And did you author that?
Jointly author it.
With Marion
with,
Hearn.
with Marion Hearn.
Right. And it says the date is 17th May 2016. If we just go, just one thing in it, please, page 5, paragraph 5.3.5, information management incident log. One of the things that was picked up here was that the online logging system provided for the exercise BEC had to be used with minimal training and wasn't set up to do anything other than record information. BEC staff were unable to filter the various tasks, outstanding items, or use it to manage their area of work. It therefore was not an effective information management and coordination tool. Was that a problem at RBKC particularly, or a problem across the BEC?
No, this is the BEC that was created for the exercise at Unified Response. So it wasn't in an existing local authority control centre. No. We were down at a disused power station in Kent and with minimal facilities. So it was just created for the purpose of the exercise. The logging system that was used, if I remember rightly, was something using Google in some way. I didn't create any of that.
Right.
At the time, RBKC's logging system, which we had created ourselves using SharePoint, Microsoft SharePoint, which the authority used for document storage, using the lists function within that, we had the incident logging system, as we called it, where we could not just enter information, but you could also record which department or sub-department. You could record whether the item was open or closed, which meant if you wished to, you could do a certain amount of interrogation at certain points, either by function or by looking to see what was left to be done. So that's what we were using in RBKC. What was used in the created exercise BEC didn't do very much. Across London at that time, I think some local authorities were still using paper-based logs. Some people were using Excel spreadsheets, logs created within that. There was no standardised electronic logging system across London.
Right, I see. Let's go then to your second statement and the recommendations that came from this exercise. If we go, please, in your second statement to page 45, paragraph 28.1, you say, page 44, I think it should be, 28.1. You say the recommendations from Exercise Unified Response were for a pan-London project to be set up, subsequently agreed by the local authorities panel of the London Resilience Forum. The purpose of the project was to take forward a review of London's local authority BEC systems, to research good practice in the management of the tactical plan for the local authority in responding to an emergency, to consider the information management and sharing systems, and to review the training required to implement a new pan-London standardised BEC. What was the progress of those recommendations at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire, which was more than a year later?
So that project group was Joe Cousins at Lambeth and myself. We, in the months following the exercise, we visited a number of London local authorities. We visited all three emergency services. We visited the military, London District military. We talked to one of the utilities, certainly. We were looking and doing research about various ways that others did their coordination of information in a control centre, and how they recorded that, and also how they dealt with this emerging tactical silver aspect of that. Wide variety of things. I think by the time of the fire, we'd certainly done a report back, and I think within that we had started to sketch out some principles that we thought should be in a future BEC system. But at this point, this was still putting out the concepts out there. This wasn't a finished document by any choice, and there was still work to be done. That simply reflected, and the other work streams from Exercise Unified Response were taking about the same time, survivor reception centres, emergency stress centres and things like that. And that reflected that we were doing this in addition to the day job, as it were.
Right. Now, considering the various training sessions and exercises that we've discussed together, other than Exercise Unified Response, which spanned 4 days, the remaining exercises, is this right, were tabletop exercises?
I believe so, yes.
Yes, and in your view, was that sufficient in order to ensure that RBKC staff were adequately trained and equipped to respond to a major emergency incident such as the Grenfell Tower fire?
Oh, certainly, we could have done better and should have done better looking at it.
Can we go to RBK 30's 35364? Now, the first page of this document is, as it says, Rebecca Blackburn's statement to the inquiry. It's her first statement. She was one of your contingency planning team, as you've told us. And if we go, please, to page 3, paragraph 12, at the top of the screen, it says, most boroughs undertake regular testing of emergency plans. This helps iron out any difficulties and ensures that everyone knows what to do. However, in my view, the borough's plans had not been properly tested. We did not undertake sufficient large-scale emergency simulations. Instead, the CPU held the odd mini-exercise. First of all, CPU, that's the contingency planning unit, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. My wider question is, do you agree with what Rebecca Blackburn says there in the second, third and fourth lines of that paragraph?
I'm not going to disagree overall.
So that's a yes, you agree?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chairman, it's 4 minutes to 1. I'm going to start on a different topic. I can start on it and probably cover a few quick questions before we get to lunch, but I'm into your hands.
Well, is it going to be a substantial topic?
Yeah, it is. As a topic, it's a substantial topic. Yes.
Well, aren't we better to start it after lunch?
We are. We're making good
I
progress.
think so, yes. Well, Mr. Kerry, it's time we had a break for lunch. Don't usually break 4 minutes early, but today I think we've got a reason to do so. So we'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 2 o'clock. And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it while they're out of the room.
Thank you.
All right? Thank you very much. Would you care to go to the usher, please? Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. 2 o'clock then, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.